the animals most deformed by consanguinity, when incest destroys entire species. This is the dark history that few know, but which has shaped the fate of entire strains in the silence of the isolated farms of rural America. For decades, consanguineous reproduction practices have taken magnificent species on the brink of functional extinction, with such severe anomalies that they challenge the understanding of nature. Our investigation begins in 1953 in the isolated mountains of Western Virginia. Here, the Peterson family managed one of the largest applicable horsepower properties in the United States. Harold Peterson, a patriarch of the family and limited man of vision, firmly believed that he could improve the race through what he called blood purification, the systematic crossing of closely related animals to preserve desirable characteristics. At that time, knowledge about genetics was extremely limited among rural breeders, explains Dr. Leonard Mitchell, historian of veterinary medicine at Cornell. Many believed that the crossing between close relatives would intensify the higher qualities of animals without understanding the devastating biological consequences. The Peterson property was more than 30 kilometers from the nearest city, in a valley surrounded by densely wooded mountains. Geographic insulation provided Harold the perfect environment to conduct its experiments without supervision or interference. Few visitors were allowed, and veterinarians were rarely called even when necessary. During the early years, the results seemed promising. Peterson Farm Appaloosa horses displayed stunning coat patterns, with unique spots and spots that attracted buyers willing to pay high prices. But behind this apparent aesthetic perfection, a silent tragedy began to unfold. In 1958, the first foals with visible anomalies began to be born. The atrophied front legs, the abnormally small eyes, and the mandibular deformities were just the beginning. Harold, however, attributed these occurrences to isolated birth accidents and continued his practice, now crossing animals that were already the product of consanguineous relationships. What we saw in the veterinary records that survived that time was alarming, says Dr. Elaine Harris, a geneticist specializing in veterinary medicine. The notes of the only veterinarian who visited the farm in 1960 describe foals with such committed immune systems that they succumbed to common infections in days. Some were born with exposed organs or had severe heart problems that prevented them from surviving more than a few hours. The situation rapidly deteriorated between 1960 and 1963. Adult horses began to have abnormal behaviors. Some became inexplicably aggressive, while others developed repetitive patterns of movements, shaking their head incessantly or walking in circles for hours. The mares were increasingly difficult to conceive and, when they could, often suffered miscarriages or would stop still. The case of the Peterson horses could have remained just another sad, unocumented episode in the history of American animal creation were it not for Raymond Foster, a young National Geographic photographer who visited the region in 1964 for a project on the Appalach Mountains. Foster arrived at the property by accident when his Jeep broke nearby, says John Harrison, local historian and author of the book Secrets of Rural Creation, The Unlisted Stories. What he witnessed would forever change the way we understand the effects of consanguinity on animal populations. Photographs taken by Foster, although never published in the magazine due to their disturbing content, documented the result of 11 years of systematic consanguineous crosses. Horses with deformed skulls, misaligned jaws that prevented proper nutrition, atrophied limbs and skins with areas completely without hair. More impressive were the eyes. Many animals had microphthalm, a condition where the eyes do not develop completely, or anophthalmia, the total absence of eyes. What Foster documented was the complete collapse of a genetic lineage, says Dr. Paul Whitman, a geneticist at the National Institute of Animal Health. Records indicate that at the point where Foster visited the farm, approximately 78% of adult animals had some visible deformity, and the child mortality rate had reached almost 90%. Harold Peterson, however, seemed unable to recognize his responsibility in the situation. In personal diaries discovered after his death, he attributed the problems to external forces, from the quality of the water, even alleged radiation from nuclear tests performed in the West. He never considered that his own reproduction practices were causing the disaster. Check it out if you are already subscribed to this channel, so as not to lose any of the stories that reveal the darkest secrets of human intervention in nature. These are truths that few have the courage to face, but we all need to know to avoid repeating the same devastating mistakes as the past. When veterinary authorities in the state of Virginia finally intervened on the Peterson property in March 1965, they found an even more serious situation than Raymond Foster's photographs had suggested. Of the 143 horses originally recorded on the farm, only 67 remained alive, and of these only 12 were in condition considered acceptable by basic animal health standards. The official report contained descriptions that shocked even the most experienced veterinarians, explains Dr. Margaret Wilson, who had access to state archives during her research to the Agriculture Department. There were horses with duplicate organs, incomplete digestive systems, and skeletal deformities so severe that animals could barely stand up. One of the most iconic cases documented was that of Midnight Star, a 4-year stallion that was the pride of Harold Peterson. The animal, product of 5 generations of consanguineous crosses, had a black coat with perfectly symmetrical white spots, a characteristic by which Peterson had selected intensively. However, Midnight Star suffered from a rare cardiac condition. His heart had only 3 functional chambers instead of 4, causing the animal to live in constant condition of hypoxia and fatigue. The case of Midnight Star perfectly exemplifies the fundamental problem of intensive consanguinity, says Dr. Thomas Reynolds, a veterinary geneticist. Harold selected only by the visible characteristic of the coat, without understanding that he was at the same time concentrating deleterious recessive genes that would normally remain hidden in genetically different populations. The science behind this disaster is complex, but fundamentally clear. When closely appeared animals reproduce, the probability that descendants inherit 2 copies of the same gene increases dramatically. If these genes carry harmful mutations, something common in all species, the result is the manifestation of diseases and anomalies that would normally remain latent. In healthy populations, these harmful genes are diluted by genetic diversity, explains Dr. Harris. Think about it as a card of cards. If you have a complete deck, the chance to take a specific to a specific one is relatively small. But if you remove most cards, leaving only a few suits, your chance to repeatedly take the same letter increases exponentially. This is what happens with problematic genes in consanguineous populations. Laboratory records of tests performed on surviving horses have revealed alarming levels of homozygosis, the condition in which an organism has identical copies of genes in both chromosomes received from parents. While healthy horses' populations typically show homozygous rates between 3% and 10%, Peterson animals displayed rates between 42% and 68%. With such homozygosis levels, it was not a matter of if genetic problems would appear, but how many and how serious they would be, says Dr. Whitman. The immune system, embryonic development, metabolism, all fundamental biological systems were compromised. The effects of consanguinity were not limited to physical deformities. The veterinarians noticed deeply disturbed behavioral patterns between animals. Sagaris systematically rejected their puppies, extremely rare behavior on healthy horses. Other animals exhibited self-elected behaviors, biting their own flanks until they caused serious wounds or repeatedly hitting their heads against the walls of the stalls. What we were observing was the collapse not only of the physical body, but also of neurological systems, explains Dr. James Bradford, a neuroscientist who later studied preserved brain tissue samples of the Peterson horses. Post-mortem analyses revealed significant malformations in the hippocampus and other crucial brain structures for instinctive behaviors and emotional regulation. One of the most tragic aspects of the Peterson case was prolonged suffering imposed on animals. Harold, unable to recognize or accept that his own practices were the cause of the problem, refused to euthanize even worse horses. Records indicate that many severely deformed animals were kept alive for years, unable to perform basic natural behaviors such as running, grazing properly, or interact normally with others of the species. The Peterson case was not only a genetic disaster, but also a monumental ethical failure, says Dr. Elizabeth Morgan, a veterinary expert. By prioritizing his distorted vision of purity about the welfare of animals, Harold created a real hell on earth for those creatures. Investigations revealed that Peterson had systematically falsified genealogical records to sell consanguineous foals as if they were from various strains. Between 1955 and 1963, he sold approximately 200 horses to farmers and breeders in at least 12 different states, spreading genes committed by a significant portion of the national genetic pool of Appaloos. The impact of the Peterson case extended far beyond that isolated property, explains Dr. Mitchell. For decades after the intervention, Appaloosa breeders across the country continued to discover genetic anomalies that could be tracked to Peterson's animals. Some of these mutations persist in the race to this day, albeit much lower thanks to deliberate efforts of genetic diversification. While the tragedy of the Peterson horses unfolded in the mountains of Virginia, an equally alarming, though less documented situation occurred in Clearwater County, Idaho. There, in the dense forests that border the Clearwater River, an isolated community of farmers dedicated to the breeding of hunting dogs perpetuated practices that would have devastating consequences for generations of animals. The history of Clearwater's dogs remained widely unknown until 1971, when veterinarian Dr. Sarah Jenkins, recently formed by the University of Idaho, accepted her first job in the region, says Michael Stevens, author of Lost in Forests, The Forgotten Northwest Communities of the American. What she found would transform her career and our understanding of the effects of consanguinity on domestic canids. The Clearwater community had been established in the 1920s, mainly formed by families seeking distance from the growing urban development of the post-First War. Living from hunting, fishing, and subsistence agriculture, they developed their own culture, deeply connected to the surrounding natural environment. Central for its subsistence was hunting, to which they strongly depended on specialized dogs. Over the decades, they developed what they called Clearwater Hound, dogs that, according to local residents, had superior tracking skills, especially for bears and large felines. The exact origins of Clearwater Hound are foggy, explains Dr. Robert Thompson, canine historian and geneticist. Fragmented records suggest an initial mixture of bloodhound, plothound, and possibly American foxhound. What we know is certainly that, from approximately 1940, the region's dog population has become extremely endogamic, with new genes rarely introduced. The community, proud of its local dogs, firmly resisted the introduction of external strains. A notebook found in Elmer Jenkins's old cabin, one of the most respected creators in the region, revealed a detailed system of crosses that explicitly favored breeding between siblings, half-siblings, and cousins. The few dogs brought from outside were rarely integrated into the main reproductive program. When Dr. Sarah Jenkins arrived in the region in 1971, he found a canine population in advanced genetic collapse. In her professional diary, later published in the Journal of Veterinary Ethics, she documented, "Clearwater's hunting dogs show the most alarming set of congenital anomalies I've ever witnessed. Approximately 60% of puppies are born with palates, whiten, mouth, while almost 80% develop severe hip dysplasia before the age of 2. The most disturbing places are what the location calls Clearwater, a condition in which the eyes are progressively covered by a membrane opaque, leading to complete blindness around the age of 4. By examining the canine population in more detail, Dr. Jenkins found that virtually all 287 dogs in the community could have their lineage tracked up to 6 founding animals of the 1930s. The coefficient of consanguinity, a mathematical measure that quantifies kinship between individuals, reached astronomical values of 43% to 51%, when values above 10% are already considered worrying in populations. Canines. With each generation, the conditions worsened. Dr. Jenkins documented lives where more than half of the puppies had cryptorchidea, failed the descent of the testicles, spine, and severe heart malformations. Even more alarming was the crescent and incidence of abnormal behaviors. Younger dogs exhibit deeply disturbed behavioral patterns, she wrote. Many develop compulsive fixations, such as unceasingly persecuting their own tails or licking certain objects until they cause tongue wounds and gums. Cases of sudden and unpredictable aggression have become common, even in previously docile animals. More worrying is the growing tendency of canine mothers rejecting or, in extreme cases, attacking their own puppies. I witnessed the empty look of these animals that carry the genetic weight of decades of wrong choices. If you are watching and feel the same indignation as me, leave in the comments. Nature deserves respect, not interference. We need to make this message echo for stories like these not repeat. Despite the scientific evidence presented by Dr. Jenkins, the community initially resisted its recommendations to introduce genetic diversity. Elmer Jenkins, unknowingly with the veterinarian, then 76 and considered the largest local authority in canine creation, argued that diluting the blood of Clearwater dogs would destroy their special hunting skills. What we see here is a recurring phenomenon in cases of consanguinity, says Dr. Morgan. Often creators develop almost mystical beliefs about the purity of their lineages, attributing extraordinary skills to animals that are actually severely compromised. It is a form of circular thinking where any distinct feature, even deficiencies, is interpreted as proof of exceptionality. The situation reached the critical point in 1973 when a particularly affected litter was born on the central property of the community. Of the 9 puppies, 7 were born with partial anencephaly, a fatal condition where parts of the brain and skull do not develop completely. The 2 survivors developed such erratic and potentially dangerous behaviors that they had to be sacrificed before they complete 6 months. This event finally broke the resistance of the community. With the reluctant permission of local elders, Dr. Jenkins implemented a genetic rehabilitation program, gradually introducing healthy external strains, while mainly maintained kinship records to avoid new consanguineous crossings. Dr. Jenkins's program represents one of the first documented genetic rescue efforts in a canine population, says Dr. Thompson. His meticulous notes on the recovery process provided a model that would later be used in several similar cases worldwide. The genetic recovery process of Clearwater dogs was long, methodic, and often frustrating. Dr. Sarah Jenkins faced not only biological challenges, but also the cultural resistance that persisted among the oldest members of the community. His professional diary, a fundamental reference for understanding this phase of history, reveals the complex dimensions of work. April 1974. Today I witnessed something that gave me hope for the first time in months, wrote Dr. Jenkins. Ruby's litter, the result of the intersection with the bloodhound brought from Boise, produced 7 puppies, all seemingly free from the cranial malformations that became almost universal here. More significantly, I saw Elmer Jenkins, the most resistant to my intervention, smiling as he watched the pups to suck vigorously. Rare behavior in recent lives. A small step, but perhaps a turning point. The recovery program implemented by Dr. Jenkins followed principles that, although known in theory, had rarely been so systematically applied to an isolated canine population. The strategy had 3 main components: controlled introduction of new breeders, genetic mapping to avoid new consanguineous crossings, and rigorous monitoring of phenotypic and behavioral traits. Dr. Jenkins's approach was notably sophisticated for the time, says Dr. Catherine Miller, conservation geneticist at the University of Colorado. Without access to modern genetic sequencing technologies, it created a diversity score system based on observable characteristics and known genealogy. Essentially, it was practicing advanced population genetics using only clinical observation and meticulous records. During the first 2 years of the program, 14 unbleed dogs were introduced, carefully selected to preserve functional characteristics valued by the community, such as keen smell and physical resistance, while diversifying the genetic pool. Dr. Jenkins insisted on maintaining detailed records of each birth, so documenting thoroughly physical characteristics, results of observed exams and behaviors. The initial results were encouraging, but not without complications. The 3rd generation of intersections showed a significant reduction in the most serious physical anomalies, with the incidence of pallets falling to approximately 12% compared to the previous 60%. However, behavioral problems persisted, particularly tendencies to hypereactivity and socialization difficulties. Clearwater's case taught us a crucial lesson on genetic recovery, explains Dr. Thompson. Some characteristics, particularly those related to complex neurological behavior and systems, may remain compromised by generations after initial genetic pool diversification. This is because many behavioral traits are polygenic, controlled by multiple genes that can remain compromised even after initial interventions. A particularly challenging moment occurred in winter 1976, when a severe snowstorm completely isolated the community for almost 3 weeks. During this period, 2 of the main external breeders died in an accident when the roof of a shed collapsed under the weight of the snow. This event threatened to reverse part of the progress achieved, but also demonstrated the growing community's commitment to the program. February 1976. "I was genuinely thrilled today," said Dr. Jenkins. "After losing Rex and Sadie in the collapse of the shed, I feared we would go back out of necessity." Instead, Thomas and Gerald Jenkins, Elmer's nephews, traveled 42 miles in the snow to reach the nearest phone and contact creators in Lewiston. They returned 5 days later with 3 new non-related dogs. The community met to cover the substantial costs of the acquisition. "Dying with us," said Gerald, "but the new ones will live with our children." Around 1980, the results of the program were undeniable. Clearwater's canine population had grown to approximately 350 animals, with reduced consanguinity coefficients to an average of 8.3%, still raised by ideal patterns, but dramatically better than the average 47% recorded in 1971. More important, the functionality of dogs as hunting assistants had not only been preserved, but significantly improved. What the Clearwater community discovered, to its surprise, was that the new dogs were superior hunters, says Stevens. With better vision, greater physical resistance and more stable behavior, they consistently surpassed the remnants of old lineages in all practical aspects of hunting. This was probably the most convincing factor for the most skeptical members of the community. Clearwater's corneal dystrophy, which previously condemned almost all dogs to progressive blindness, had become relatively rare, affecting less than 5% of the population. Severe skeletal anomalies had been reduced to levels comparable to those of normal canine populations. More significantly, abnormal behaviors such as self-harm and impulsive aggression had decreased dramatically. Dr. Jenkins in Clearwater's work was finally published in the prestigious magazine Genetics and Animal Conservation in 1982, bringing international attention to the case. Its article, "Genetic Recovery in Isolated Canine Populations, the Clearwater Model," it has become a must-read in veterinary medicine programs and genetic conservation. The most important legacy of the Clearwater case was not just dogs saved in that specific community, concludes Dr. Miller. It was the practical demonstration that populations severely committed by consanguinity can be recovered with methodological and patient intervention. The principles established by Jenkins have been subsequently applied in various situations, from workbirds on the brink of functional extinction to wild populations isolated in fragmented natural reserves. This scientific legacy, however, does not decrease the reality of suffering experienced by animals during the decades that preceded the intervention. Since Dr. Jenkins herself wrote in her final reflections, "Every documented malformation, every observed abnormal behavior represents a senseful life experiencing unnecessary pain and confusion. True triumph will be when such interventions become unnecessary, because we finally understand that diversity is not just statistically desirable, but ethically imperative." While cases of the Peterson horses and Clearwater dogs may seem relics of a less enlightened past, the uncomfortable truth is that similar practices continue to occur in various contexts of contemporary animal creation. The lessons of these historical cases remain dolor relevant in the 21st century. The phenomenon we see today is more insidious because it often hides under the cloak of preservation or racial purity, explains Dr. Elena Rodriguez, an expert in animal welfare and ethics of creation. In many modern canine races, for example, alarming consanguinity coefficients are normalized in the name of arbitrary aesthetic patterns. One of the most emblematic cases of the modern era involves the English bulldog, a breed whose genetic pool became so restricted that recent genomic studies suggest that current genetic diversity is equivalent to what would exist if only 68 unbleed dogs had founded the entire modern race. In fact, thousands of bulldogs exist, but with so similar genetic material that they actually represent a much smaller number of unique individuals. Modern bulldog is essentially a walking warning letter about the dangers of consanguinity, says Dr. Whitman. Virtually everyone suffers from severe brachycephaly, leading to chronic breathing problems so serious that many airlines refuse to transport them due to the risk of death during the flight. More than 80% need cesarean sections for reproduction because the selection for head and wide shoulders made natural birth impossible. The genetic consequences of consanguinity are not limited to specific races or particular species. In the dairy cattle breeding industry, the situation has become particularly alarming. A study published in 2019 revealed that 99% of Holstein bulls used in artificial insemination in the United States can have their tracked lineage up to only 2 founding animals of the 1960s. The situation of Holstein cattle is a perfect example of how economic pressures can accelerate genetic disasters, says Dr. Frank Anderson, a production animal genetics expert. The intensive selection for milk production resulted in cows that produce impressive quantities, more than 30,000 pounds compared to 5,000 of a typical 1950 cow, but with devastating consequences for longevity, fertility, and animal welfare. Modern Holstein cows typically survive only 4 to 5 years in production, compared to 15 to 20 years of natural expectation of life. Fertility problems have become so common that many farms consider it normal that a cow needs 3 to 5 inseminations to successfully conceive when historically 1 or 2 were enough. What we are witnessing is a form of genetic extremism, continues Dr. Anderson. We are essentially creating animals that are efficient short-term milk production machines, but fundamentally dysfunctional as complete biological organisms. The case of the Arab horses of exposure represents another worrying contemporary example. Selection for extreme facial characteristics, particularly the concave profile known as dish face, resulted in a population where neurological, respiratory, and dental problems became common. Some of the award-winning Arab horses in large exhibitions have so extreme cranial malformations that they would have been considered severe deformities just 50 years ago, explains Dr. Wilson. We see animals with nostrils so small that dramatically limited respiratory capacity and such concave facial profiles that result in chewing problems and dental malocclusion, all in the name of an aesthetic pattern that has been taken to the extreme. Perhaps even more disturbing is the silence that often surrounds these problems. Creators, exhibition judges, and races associations often minimize or completely ignore the genetic consequences of these practices, focusing exclusively on the aesthetic characteristics valued in the competition circuit. There is a conspiracy of silence in the world of breeding animals, says Dr. Howard Bennett, a veterinarian and former judge of canine exhibitions that has become a vocal critic of modern practices. Behind the scenes, everyone recognizes the problems. We see puppies that die from heart malformations, adults who can barely breathe, and animals that develop devastating neurological conditions. But publicly, we continue to reward the most extreme specimens, perpetuating the cycle. In the context of wild animals and conservation programs, the lessons in cases Peterson and Clearwater acquire additional importance. When populations of threatened species are reduced to critically low numbers, the risk of endogamic depression becomes a significant challenge for recovery efforts. The case of the cheaper Achinonyx jubatus dramatically illustrates this phenomenon. Genetic studies show that the world's population has gone through at least 2 severus genetic bottlenecks, periods when the population was reduced to such low numbers that genetic diversity was drastically meeting. Modern cheepids have so limited genetic diversity that they are practically clones from each other from the immunological point of view, explains Dr. Samantha Lewis, a conservation biologist. This means that a single infectious disease could potentially decimate the whole population, as all individuals share the same immunological vulnerabilities. It is like having a human population where everyone has exactly the same blood type and the same allergies. This genetic homogeneity manifests itself in alarming reproductive problems. More than 70% of male guepard sperm have morphological abnormalities, and semen quality is consistently low. Females often produce small lives, and child mortality is significantly higher than in greatest genetic diversity. What we see in the guepard today is the result of natural consanguinity forced by population reductions, continues Dr. Lewis. But the worrying thing is that we are deliberately creating similar situations in captive populations of other threatened species when we do not adequately manage genetic diversity. The irony is that while the negative effects of consanguinity are well documented and scientifically understood, practices that promote genetic homogeneity continue to prevail in various contexts of animal breeding. This disconnection between scientific and practical knowledge represents one of the greatest challenges for animal welfare in the 21st century. We know better, but we often don't do better, says Dr. Rodriguez. Historical cases like Peterson and Clearwater should serve as powerful warnings, but instead we often repeat the same errors in even larger scales, now with the aid of advanced reproductive technologies. Artificial insemination, for example, allows a single breeder to generate tens of thousands of descendants, something impossible through natural reproduction. When this breeder carries problem genes, the negative impact is exponentially amplified through the population. In the age of reproductive biotechnology, the risks of genetic homogeneity are even greater, warns Dr. Whitman. A popular dairy bull may have its semen distributed globally and produce more than 100,000 descendants. If we later find that it carries a problematic genetic mutation, the damage is already disseminated by multiple generations and geographies. The fundamental question that emerges from these historical and contemporary cases is about ethics, responsibility, and our relationship with other species. Intensive consanguinity represents a form of human interference in the fundamental biology of other creatures that often result in unnecessary suffering. What the cases of Peterson and Clearwater teach us, above all, is about humility, reflects Dr. Morgan. They remind us that interfering with the basic evolutionary mechanisms that maintain the health of animal populations often results in unintentional but profoundly harmful consequences. Genetic diversity is not a luxury or an abstract preference. It is the founding of health and biological functionality. There are, however, signs encouraging change. In 2019, the United Kingdom Kennel Club implemented new guidelines for English Bulldogs creators, French Bulldogs and Pugs, aiming to reduce extreme brachycephaly in these races. Outcrossing programs have been started for particularly committed races, carefully introducing genetic material of related races to expand genetic pool without losing essential defining characteristics. The Moon for Dalmatian program is an excellent example of how we can address genetic problems without abandoning the concept of defined races, explains Dr. Thompson. Introducing a single crossing with a pointer, followed by generations of pure Dall. In the context of wild species conservation, sophisticated strategies for genetic management are being implemented to maximize genetic diversity in reduced populations. The Mexican Wolf Recovery Program, Canis lupus bailey, for example, uses advanced genomic analyses to determine the ideal crossings between captive individuals, maximizing the retention of genetic variation. We are finally recognizing that preserving only numbers is not enough, says Dr. Lewis. We need to preserve functional genetic diversity if we want these species to survive in the long run. A purely numerical success that results in a genetically compromised population is not really a success of conservation. As advanced in the 21st century, the lessons of Peterson and Clearwater remain fundamental to our understanding of ethical responsibility in animal creation and conservation. These stories remind us that our power to shape other species through reproductive selection brings with it the obligation to understand and respect the fundamental biological principles that support health and animal welfare. The true legacy of these cases is not only in the suffering they have documented, but in the lessons they offer us, concludes Dr. Rodriguez. They show us that respect for biological integrity and genetic diversity is not only scientifically solid, but ethically imperative. Our interventions in animal reproduction should be guided not only by aesthetic or productive goals, but for a fundamental commitment to the welfare of animals under our care. If you watched so far, it is because you liked this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched here," so I can meet you and know who really likes the stories here on the channel. Be sure to subscribe to accompany our investigations that reveal the darkest and more educational truths on the impacts of human intervention on animal nature. Leave your like to support this awareness work and share it with friends and family who need to know these important stories about the consequences of animal consanguinity. Together, we can promote a future where respect for genetic diversity and animal welfare guide our practices of creation and conservation.